You know Santa Claus. Everyone does. But behind the red suit and the reindeer, there's a real historical figure. A bishop named Nicholas, born in the 3rd century AD in the city of Myra on the southern coast of what is now Turkey. His city is still there, or rather, what's left of it is. Because Myra is buried, sealed under meters of mud, a perfectly preserved 13th century chapel was found beneath the ground in 2009 using underground radar. Its walls are intact, its frescoes are vivid. A cross carved into the stone still casts its shadow onto the altar when sunlight hits it at the right angle. A city that held one of the most important saints in Christian history, still sitting underground, untouched, largely because nobody went looking for it. And when you check what the old maps say about Myra, the questions start multiplying fast. Here's the version we're given. Myra was an ancient Greek city in the region of Lycia on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. It became an important Roman port. The Apostle Paul stopped there on his journey to Rome. It's mentioned in the book of Acts. It later became a Byzantine city and the seat of a bishop. The most famous of those bishops was Nicholas in the 3rd century AD, the man whose legend eventually became Santa Claus. By the 13th century, official history says Myra was largely abandoned. Arab invasions in the 7th and 9th centuries weakened it. Seljuk Turks seized the city in the 11th century, and then, in the 13th century, heavy seasonal rains sealed its fate, burying the city under layers of sediment from the surrounding rivers and valleys. That's the story. Clean, linear, settled. Except the chapel tells a different story, and the maps tell a different one again. Before we go further, as always, everything I share here is the best of what I've been able to find and piece together. If something sits differently with what you know, please don't take it personally, and neither will I. Think of me as someone who reads a lot, but certainly hasn't read everything. Nothing I present here is the final word. Evidence changes, understanding shifts. I'd far rather be honestly uncertain than confidently wrong. Now, let's continue. In 2009, archaeologists used ground-penetrating radar near the modern town of Demre, the same town built on top of ancient Myra, and detected anomalies underground. The shape and size of the readings suggested walls and buildings. Over the next 2 years, they excavated a small chapel, 13th century, and what they found stopped them. The chapel is in an almost uncanny state of preservation. Frescoes still vivid on the walls, structural integrity intact from floor to ceiling. The only significant damage is at the very top, the dome, which was at the surface level. Now, here's the detail that matters. If the city had been buried gradually, sediment slowly accumulating over decades, you'd expect more damage at the bottom and progressively better preservation toward the top, where burial would be more recent. That's not what they found. The preservation is consistent from bottom to top. The only exception is the dome, which was at the surface level. That pattern, uniform preservation with damage only at the very top, is the signature of a rapid burial event, not gradual accumulation, something sudden. The archaeologist directing the excavation said it directly. This is like Pompeii, and we've already looked at Pompeii in a previous video, so that comparison carries weight. The chapel was built from stones recycled from older buildings and tombs, which means when it was constructed in the 13th century, the city around it was already being dismantled, repurposed, and its material reused. And then, very shortly after, it was buried. So we have a city buried rapidly in what the official story calls the 13th century. But when you go to the maps and look for Myra, you run into a problem. The timeline doesn't hold. Here's what you expect to find if Myra was an ancient, important city that was buried in the 1200s. You'd expect it to be on maps from the 1500s onward, referenced as ruins, a former location, a lost city, the way Troy appears on maps as ruins, the way other abandoned ancient cities leave a cartographic trace. Go through the maps of Turkey from the David Rumsey collection, and you'll find something that doesn't fit that expectation. Look at the 1665 map. Myra's there, labeled, located on the southern Lycian coast. Now look at the 1686 map. Still there. But before the 1650s, the city that appears consistently in that region is not Myra, it's Patara, a different city, slightly further west on the same coastline, which the Bible also mentions as a port Paul visited. Patara is on maps from the early 1500s onward. Myra is not. For an ancient city supposedly buried in the 13th century, Myra is conspicuously absent from 3 centuries of cartographic record and then suddenly appears in the 1650s. And then, look at this 1707 map. Just half a century after Myra first starts appearing on maps with any consistency, it's already labeled as ruins. Official history says Myra was buried in the 1200s. The maps show it appearing in the 1650s and labeled as ruins by 1707. That's a window of roughly 50 years, not centuries of prior existence followed by medieval burial. The pattern here is identical to what we found with Troy, a city that, according to official history, ceased to exist thousands of years ago, showing up on 17th century maps and then labeled as ruins within a generation. Now let's talk about who lived here. This 1687 text from the Travels of Monsieur de Thévenot gives us a contemporary account of St. Nicholas. It says he was a native of Patara, which we've just seen on the maps as the older city of that coastline. He was ordained as a priest by the Bishop of Myra, described here as the metropolis of Lycia. He became Bishop of Myra himself. His body was later moved to Bari in southern Italy in 1087, where it is still venerated today. This is the man, the historical Bishop Nicholas of Myra, the one whose feast day falls on the 6th of December, the one whose legend, over centuries of retelling and cultural layering, became Santa Claus. His city is buried under mud in southern Turkey, but there's a layer to Myra's identity that goes deeper than Nicholas. Before it was a Christian city, before it had a bishop at all, Myra was known for something else entirely. The city's protective goddess was Artemis Eleutheria. The Temple of Artemis in Myra was described as the most splendid building in all of Lycia. Its image was on the city's own coins. And look at this, a poem found in historical records. It reads, "Nor Venus nor Diana will we name. Myra is Venus and Diana too. All that was feigned of them, applied to her, is true." Myra is Venus, Myra is Diana. All that the old goddesses were said to be, that, the poet says, applies to her. The medieval legend says Bishop Nicholas destroyed the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. Another account suggests he simply managed to close the temple of the goddess in his own city. In other words, the transition from Artemis to Nicholas in Myra may be less a story of ancient history and more a story of a recent institutional replacement, a pagan sanctuary becoming a Christian one. When that transition actually happened and how recently is a question the maps raise without fully answering. So here is what we actually have. A city buried under mud in a pattern consistent with rapid, sudden entombment, not the gradual sediment accumulation the official account describes. A cartographic record that shows Myra appearing only in the 1650s, becoming ruins by 1707, while official history places its abandonment in the 1200s. A connection to St. Nicholas, the historical root of Santa Claus, whose city has been sitting underground, largely unexcavated, beneath a modern Turkish town, and the pre-Christian identity rooted in the goddess Artemis, whose temple was one of the greatest in the ancient world, and whose replacement by Christian institutions may have happened far more recently than the official timeline suggests. The archaeologists at the excavation called it a 13th century Pompeii. That's a striking comparison, and for anyone who has looked closely at Pompeii's own timeline, it's a comparison worth sitting with. The mud is still there, the chapel is still there, most of Myra is still underground. What exactly is buried down there and when it was actually buried remains an open question. If this made you curious, share it and check out the other videos on this channel that follow the same thread.